Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are rebuilding their shelters on Wednesday, days after a huge fire swept through parts of the world's biggest refugee settlement. According to the United Nations, 15 people were killed on Monday, with hundreds still missing. The fire forced about 45,000 people from their bamboo and plastic huts. The blaze is the latest and the biggest over the past year in the crowded camps in southeast Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar district. Bangladeshi authorities say that they're investigating the cause. Inside the camp, children were seen searching through ashes, whilst adults nearby were surveying the damage and clearing the rubble. Some 1 million Rohingya refugees live in camps in Cox's Bazar with little hope of returning to their homes in Myanmar, where most have been refused citizenship and face persecution. Rohingya refugees are rebuilding shelters, as I said, after this deadly fire has destroyed their camps. The CEO of Restless Beings, an international human rights organization, Mabrur Ahmed, is watching the story unfold, and he joins us on Zoom from London. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to be back, but under, unfortunately, some quite sad times.
It is a tragic story, but I guess camps such as this, lots of people in a contained area are always going to be vulnerable to this kind of thing.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I think really and honestly and truly, if I'm going to put my real opinion across, I think refugee camps in and of themselves are deeply, deeply problematic. It's really for the people who inhabit refugee camps, they're moving from one hell, whether they're suffering from a persecution, a violence, a genocide, or a natural man-made disaster, from one area into another area. And really what the refugee camp is essentially a waiting room to see whether or not the international community care enough to help those people out of those refugee camps and back into normal lives. And of course, the way that refugee camps are set up internationally is that there's an enormous amount of people in a very congested small space. And of course, the provisions of daily life are simply not sufficient. And so accidents like these will happen time and time again, whether deliberate or, as I said, unintentional.
Do we know what happened at all at this stage, or it's too early?
I mean, it's virtually impossible to give you an absolute account of what happened. What we do know, however, was that there were two separate fires, not too far from each other, and they eventually, and you mentioned in your intro already, you know, with huts made from bamboo and plastic sheets, so fire spreads very, very rapidly. They eventually joined together, creating an kind of unfathomable fire and a ball of absolute destruction. And even some of the numbers that you mentioned, you know, I would hasten to add that those are simply what we know as official numbers. You know, 15 deaths is very, very conservative, I would say. The amount of images and video footage that we've received at Restless Beings here, there's countless number of dead bodies that we've witnessed, unfortunately. And again, you know, a couple of hundred is a very conservative estimate of numbers missing. I would put that at least the mid to late hundreds, maybe even touching to 1,000 people who are missing. And again, about 10,000 homes were destroyed, and according to our estimation, that renders about 80,000 people who are now displaced from an already displaced position.
This isn't the first fire. There have been several already this year, and I just wonder, the authorities, and lessons not learned after at least the first two fires, let's say.
Well, I mean, I think one of the destruction was even more evident in this fire because simply of the fact that the Bangladesh government has had a policy of almost ring fencing the camps with barbed wire, you know, around the perimeter of certain camps. And this was one of those camps which had barbed wire around the camp. And it meant that people who were trying to escape from the fire simply were not able to escape from the fire. And then, of course, when you look at vulnerable, such as children and the elderly, and of course you have mobility issues. That was another reason why we've seen the level of destruction that we saw in terms of the numbers of people missing and the numbers of dead. Amongst the dead were, of course, the humans and the Rohingya, but also alongside that, many dozens of cattle and chicken, etc., were also burnt alive, unable to escape. Look, one of the things is about planning. Refugee camps are generally not planned because, of course, of the emergency situation that people are coming over and the number of people that came over from Burma into Bangladesh, 1 million plus. So the camps were not designed in such a way where congestion could be eased in certain areas, or there could be protocols of evacuations, etc. We're talking about a population that's been built very rapidly in not really that kind of livable conditions, where small hills surrounding all the camps, and so you have the issue of, like I said, mobility in terms of climbing up and climbing down some of these hills for children and elderly and pregnant women is particularly tasking. There's a number of reasons, really, a plethora of reasons of how and why these fires might have started and how they can be avoided. One of the big issues that the authorities faced in this particular fire was they weren't able to put the fire out simply because the roads are way too narrow, the gullies were way too narrow for fire services to be able to get to, and for ambulance and paramedic personnel to be able to reach those who were injured.
It's hard to believe, but I mean, this setup has been there 4 or 5 years now. This is how people have had to live.
Absolutely. And, I think when you're talking about the number of people that have been affected, whether that's 45,000 or whether that's 80,000, that's almost 10% of the entire Rohingya population. That's a huge amount of people. And when you look at the satellite images as well, you'll see, a bustling area reduced to absolute ashes within the matter of hours, and virtually no one could do anything to stop it. Of course, the reality of that, apart from the numbers, apart from the destruction, is there are real lives beneath it, right? So we've seen today lots of images, lots of footage, and our staff are assisting people who are going back to the site of the fire, back to where their homes were, just to simply try and pick up and piece together their life and any belongings that they may have had. We had distressing images of women and children going back to their original places and even picking up things like potatoes, which had simply not been burnt, and that had managed to be sustained to some degree, and using those because they simply don't have the food to eat. Families were left kind of from one part of the camp to another part of the camp, unable to communicate with each other. There's no coordination as a rescue point or as a safety point where people could meet up together again. So there's still many people who are estranged from their families, unfortunately.
I believe on top of where these people are sleeping in, other essential infrastructure was destroyed, like hospitals, distribution points, learning centres. And this, of course, is just more misery for an already burdened population.
Of course, and I think what we have to remember is that this population are reliant almost 100% on foreign donations and from whatever the Bangladesh government can do for them. There's very little that they can do for themselves. So they find themselves leaving Burma in 2017 from burning villages, their children being burnt alive, women being raped and people being murdered. They cross the border over. They're in a very, very tight, congested space, literally waiting for people to come and give them food and some sort of sustenance. And then a few years down the line, when they were expecting by now they would have returned back to their homelands, they still find themselves in an estranged country and yet again are trying to escape and pick up their pieces from fire and destruction, which is essentially not their own fault. They have not contributed to this in any way, shape or form. It's been a lack of poor planning and essentially poor policy as well.
I mean, they were already nervous about going back home even before the coup. And now with the coup in place, it's not even a remote possibility for them.
I think there's been some subtle signs of potential hope for the Rohingya. Dr. Sasa, who is now the UN kind of convoy for Myanmar, has actually, this morning tweeted out calling the Rohingya his brothers and sisters and expressing a deep sympathy for their plight. That is quite significant. And to be honest with you, at the moment, they are just words and it hasn't translated to any action. But if someone quite senior amongst the potential administration of the new Burma, let's say, or the new Myanmar, is able to suggest such support, then there is obviously hope for the future. What I would say, with that in mind, is that how much of this is because of garnering international support and how much of it is genuine remains to be seen. But it's better than what it was before. The coup itself, whether or not it's going to be successful, is another entire discussion in and of itself. It doesn't seem to be the people, the protesters and the general public do seem to be unrelenting in their quest for democracy, but equally the military seems to be unrelenting in its power grip and violence towards squashing any type of democratic movement that's about to unfold in Myanmar as well.
Mabrur, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for helping us tell these very important stories. Thank you.
Good evening.
All right, that's Mabrur Ahmed joining us from London about the plight of the Rohingya, whose camp, one of the largest camps there, destroyed partly by fire. And hundreds believed to have died and thousands displaced in a displaced situation.